Welcome to Fields of Consciousness, the podcast for consciousness conversations with myself, Jeffrey Stegman.
And myself, Clayten Stedman.
As consciousness explorers and founders of Focus Life Force Energy, we're here to bring a holistic approach to consciousness and share practical examples of how you can take your life to the next level. From your thoughts to your environment, let's explore together how consciousness interacts with our everyday experiences.
In our last episode, we discussed the concept of consciousness. In this episode, we'll cover fields of consciousness and how they express through people, places, and things. Welcome to the podcast.
Jeff and Clayten here on the Fields of Consciousness podcast. Today we'll be discussing what are fields of consciousness and how they show up in people, places, and things. So Clayten, what are fields of consciousness? Can you help us out there?
Yeah, so a field of consciousness is a quality and a quantity of energy. It's also known as a feeling, and this includes the history of the place, the land, the people in the area. It's a compilation of thought forms in the space, which includes the humans and their relationship with the animals. A lot of the native traditions talk about animals and how they influence an area. I'm just reminded of a story. There's a famous story about loons. It's one of the birds that you might have seen up in Maine, Jeff. And when a pair of loons or a loon dies on a lake, if a new loon or pair of loons moves into that lake, they sing the same song that the previous loon sang, the same song that's been on that land for, I guess maybe indefinitely.
Wow, like the memory of the song
The
is
memory
there?
of the song is on the land. Yeah.
Wow, that's
I always
interesting.
loved that story. Yeah.
So people commonly think of it as energy, like you walk into a space and say, wow, the energy feels good or the energy doesn't feel good. So you're saying there's a quality of the energy and maybe a quantity, like a really intense space could be like the quantity, like something feels really good or really bad. Is that?
Yeah, exactly. That's of course different people have different levels of sensitivity, but you can't ignore the quantity aspect of it. It's like when these pilgrimage sites around the world, it's almost the level of intensity of the positive energy makes the positive experience or in some cases what are known as nonlinear events or miracles happen because it's that typically a level of devotion that people have brought to the land. And oftentimes there is certain energetic influences in the area, like there's ley lines crossing and there's things that amplify the experience naturally. Like many churches, of course, are built over ley lines where the pulpit where the preacher is giving a sermon from, in a traditional sense, there's a crossing of ley lines there because it's an amplification of energy. So people that designed these spaces in the past knew this, and in some ways it's a lost art, and in some ways it continues to grow. Those are a couple of real life examples, and they're everywhere. The fields, they're not just with people; they're in objects and around spaces, as we've said. So,
yeah, people, places, and things. And yeah, I've noticed in cathedrals in Europe that feeling. You walk in, say the front door where everybody comes in, and there's a certain feeling. And I've noticed that the closer I get to where the priest, is delivering. I mean, normally I'd be visiting when no one, there's just a crowd of people visiting. But it seemed the closer I would get to the front, the more intense the feeling would be. like that quantity of energy was higher, and the quality would be such
Mm.
that, like in the front row, if I sat down in the front row, and I did this a number of times, my mind would just be
Mm.
empty. It would feel like the quality of the energy was just clarifying or cleaning out my mind. So cathedrals, really, I've noticed that, and it seems to be very local in the cathedral itself. Like the closer you get to the front, the more it was happening.
Yeah, I mean, some of these cathedrals, especially some of the ones in Europe, like Chartres and the well-known ones, it took 300 years to build, hundreds of years to build. And
Mm,
so you have obviously a pretty conscious decision to build that type of building where there is an energetic imprint that is most relevant for what's going to happen on that property. And then you have
mm,
literally hundreds of years of tradespeople. They'll cover the finest tradespeople in their craft, working on the land. Like with the buildings and all those marble pieces of marble or granite, whatever they're working with. They're all holding the thoughts and the devotion of the tradespeople. And typically
mm,
there's different prayers at different and celebrations at different levels of completion of the cathedral. I know I swung a hammer for a few years back when I was a kid, and one of the things they always did in a building was when you put the roof on, you had a party. So kind of a similar thing.
yeah, I had a party experience recently. You could say it felt that way. The energy was really strong and very exciting and fun. Was going to a dance
Mm.
performance. So we walked as soon as I walked into the auditorium. Just this level of excitement, and of course everyone's buzzing and talking. But there's this beautiful lighting up on the stage, and the lights come down. But the quality of energy was really of like excitement and anticipation and beauty. And so what's going on there, Clayten? Like in a ballet troupe or a dance troupe, that would create that kind of energy or that field of consciousness in that space.
Well, when you get into something as at the professional level of like a Broadway musical or um, God, what's that troupe? They put on Cats, and you have all these people swinging from these silk or ropes. It'll come to me. They were Cirque du Soleil, yeah, in Vegas. Well, that's where I was supposed to them. So you have a historical tradition with ballet, hundreds of years old, and you have a disciplined devotion physically as it relates to movement. The strength of the dancer, the form. It's there's a lot of endurance involved in that, and just general fitness. Uh,
Seemed to be the audience seemed to be part of it too. In this case, like there was a feeling of like anticipation of the performance, and of course, this was people hadn't seen a performance for the
yeah,
whole year, so it was one of the first ones. So was that part of it too? The audience and the space.
yeah. I've noticed, as the restrictions are lifting from COVID, if I go to a live event, there's an extra level of electricity in the air. Literally, it's like almost crackling. Um, I think it's just that we've been apart from each other for so long in large groups that there's an extra level of anticipation. And but in general, there's a reverence, the audience has for what it takes to be a professional performer at that level. And there's an anticipation and just the appreciation of the artists. I think probably in Europe, it's a little more um, well known when you go to the opera, where your parents took you and your grandparents took your parents, and they know the arias, they know the songs, they know which note the singer should be
Mm,
hitting at a certain level, and if they've practiced a little bit themselves, they have a personal experience of what that
mm.
is, and uh, yeah.
Yeah, there seemed to be like a potential energy building prior to, and then the kinetic energy of the event, which I'm sure could be true for sporting events, where the field that was created or activated by all that first anticipation of the potentiality of the event, and then the actual movement, and the just gorgeous movement, and like watching the Olympics is a similar kind of thing. We're like, wow, the human body is just amazing that it can do these things and do it so beautifully and perfectly, and the interaction between the dancers. So there seemed to be both the anticipation and the kinetic energy of it.
Yeah, it's a good point, especially in the physical arts. I mean, we all have a body that we have to move around, and sometimes it doesn't always cooperate. So when you see somebody moving that gracefully and doing extreme maneuvers of strength or flexibility or coordination or speed, whatever it is. So the Olympics are a great example, because we're just it's more relative. Not many of us take ballet.
So being in that, in that location, in that auditorium at that time, this field was there, this feeling, this energy was there. And what we're saying also that can, also be in place and remain there, that there's a history of that energy that builds up over time. So all the performances in that auditorium accumulate that energy. So maybe even between performances, you may feel the energy when you walk into the space.
Yes, and that's true on the positive and also on the negative. I know that in some places, and in Europe and England in particular, at least that's what I'm aware of, is the soccer games, because I'm a soccer fan. And they have, a lot of fights and riots, and there's certain areas where in the stadium where they tend to happen. And I imagine the challenge with ballet might be vanity or something to that effect. But there's also the dark side of that. If you've ever walked into a war, an old battlefield, a war zone, or an old prison, if you go on a tour of Alcatraz Island or someplace like that, that energy is still there. But thoughts are things, and energy gets held in a space.
Yeah, so we'll get more into places in a minute. I'd love to explore more of that with you. But I'm also thinking about between the troop members in a dance group, that there's this field act created where they're able to move in such, synchronicity. And it reminds me of books I've read and studied related to fields between firefighters and first responders, rescue workers, where they're connected to each other, even though they're maybe at a distance in, say, a rescue area like this, what's happening down with the condo in Florida, where they're searching, and there's a nonverbal communication that is reported in these instances where the rescue workers are communicating with each other and doing things that are not, you wouldn't see them communicating. They were not even looking at each other, but they're coordinating in a way that's just a natural. There seems to be a field that's activated in those kind of situations between people, or in a group, that may be similar to what's happening in the dance troupe.
Yeah, I remember once I was going out to this event, and I was living in the Lower Mainland near Vancouver, and someone was coming to pick me up from the bus stop. I'd taken the bus out towards this farm. There was going to be this event at a farm, and the person who was picking me up, they kind of knew what time I was going to be there and generally where I'd be standing, the big bus terminal. And we had a few minutes of kind of looking for each other. And then finally, we just called each other on our cell phones. And what they said was, I didn't want to call you on my cell phone. I wanted to connect with you telepathically and find you that way. And I thought that was really interesting because, since gotten cell phones. I mean, I don't even know some of my friends' phone numbers because I just pull out my cell phone and dial it. So yeah, the connection between people is. Yeah, you remember you telling me about those firefighter stories. They've really tested that. Like, they've got some good science around it. Yeah.
There is, yeah, yeah. There is some kind of field, and what this research was doing was trying to, how do we recreate this? Say in a business environment or other creative environments, and it seems like dance troops would be a place to study as well. And there's this kind of sports teams where that nonverbal field is created between people, and it's something that we do in our work together, the two of us, and with other people in the FLFE business, is consciously create a field over time where it makes the work and the creative parts of what we do happen more easily, or truth seems to appear in these higher fields more naturally in higher ways. So.
Yeah, there's things that I'm trying to figure out on my own, and then when we get together, I can get the answer. I just can't get it on my own. And oftentimes it's related to our business because that's the field we've created and it's there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we talked last episode about walking around in the world and feeling in your body what it feels like, and that. So walking into a place, say, like you mentioned, a prison or an old battlefield, and feeling that energy or that field of consciousness that's there. What other examples have you had walking around, Clayten, in the world?
Yeah, well, I was on holidays once in the Middle East, and it's a World Heritage Site. It was a large oasis that really became the capital. I mean, water is essential to life, and they built this enormous fort around the oasis, around the spring. And in the fort, there was these places where, there was traps where you'd have like a pit you'd fall into, and there'd be like, they took the stakes out in case somebody fall in, but there'd be like, stakes at the bottom. And those places had kind of a weird energy around them. And different parts of the fort just felt different. But the place that I really noticed was in the prison, where they had people shackled up, and the extreme heat over there. People would really be suffering if they were, especially if they were dehydrated. And when I walked down into that area where those people were, there was chains on the walls and the shackles for the feet and everything, and that was one of the creepiest places I've ever been. Probably as creepy as any place I've ever been. So that's a real, it's kind of a real life story of,
So, yeah, it's an example of a sort of a negative or low energy feeling, a field of consciousness that has that sort of experience there. And we've talked about cathedrals and places where people are meeting and connecting with divinity or celebrating the beauty of life, like in the performance space for the dance troupe. And I guess sports would fit into that same, in a place, a stadium that has, regular audiences, like you mentioned, soccer in the U.S., football and baseball and so forth.
Yeah, and there is this thing called the home team advantage, right? Statistically, people win in their home arena because of the fans. There is people that typically travel in between games, but the fans come to watch the home team. They cheer them on, and I think the positivity and the love that they're getting from the fans, it energizes the players. That's a real example.
So, Clayten, do you think in terms of the history of the place and the field of consciousness held by this crystalline structure and by the space would also affect the game in that way? I mean, you got the fans that are there at the time, but you have the fans from maybe decades of games there.
Yeah,
and all the practice sessions.
I thought about that as much as the live event. Yeah, that makes sense. I don't know how we measure that, but my inner measurement geek is trying to figure out how to do that.
So that's, we've covered places, and it appears from our work and things we've noticed in the FLFE environments is that a field of consciousness can be portable. I mean, people move around, so their consciousness fields move around with them, but it can also happen with an object. And you've got a story about a dorje, a Tibetan object, and the field around it. What was that story, Clayten?
Yeah. Oh, that's right. So a friend of mine was in India, and they walked into this shop. I think it was up in, I don't know if it's pronounced Lapsa or Laksa, where the Dalai Lama has moved to. It was in that area, and the shopkeeper had some of the people who were escaping from Tibet during the Chinese invasion. Um, he would sell some of the artifacts that were from the temples, because they were just trying to help people get out of Tibet, and people were starving, so the uh, the abbots actually asked that people that were getting out take these objects, sell them, and get the money back to help more people escape. And so she walked into this shop, and she had a sense of going to the back corner, and she went to the back corner of the shop, and there was kind of some rugs in a pile and some fabric on top of it, and she had a sense there was something under that pile that was pulling her. And she went and asked the shopkeeper, and he came back, and under the blankets and the rugs was a double dorje. And the shop owner knew the brother of an abbot, or the leader of a Tibetan monastery, and they intentedly, or with intent, put that double dorje in that back corner, and they would only sell it to a person who came and found it on their own volition. And this lady
Mm.
was a spiritual devotee. She'd been on a path for decades on her own way, and
Mm.
and that's how she became the steward of the dorje. And she
Mm.
purchased it, and that helped those people, get out of Tibet, or
Mm.
feed the people that were needing fed or clothed, whatever. So that was it's a pretty mystical kind of story, but those dorjes, that dorje had been, I think, had been in that one monastery for over 300 years, and so
Mm.
people had been praying with it and working with it.
So it had a consciousness from all of that, and plus the intention for it to be found, and so it attracted her. So in some future episodes, we may talk about attractor fields and how consciousness can be an attractor. But in that case, it was like a magnet to the back of the shop for
Yeah, it was
her.
a great story. I'd forgotten about that one. Yeah, it's you just can't make that stuff up.
So we talked about fields created between people, like as we've experienced
Mm-hmm.
in the creation of FLFE, that this quantum, it's commonly known as maybe a quantum resonance or a quantum association, or at least in the quantum world, where you have a connection that occurs, with no space or time delay. Classic example being when you think of someone and they call you, a few seconds later. And what we believe is there's a field activated when the person thinks of you. So you have this connection between two people. One of them is thinking of the other one, and that connection then, or quantum resonance, occurs, and they think of they think of them and
Mm-hmm.
they call. And many of us have experienced that.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever talked to a mother and they didn't have some story about how their child was in some kind of trouble or something was wrong, and they knew it. My mother's told me
Mm,
different stories when I was a kid. One time they were doing some construction on the street, and there was like one end of it was kind of graded going in, and they were digging up, I think, the sewer line. I was a kid. I was just walking around, and turn your head, and the kid will be gone, right? And I ended up in this ditch. It took them a long time to find me, but she
mm,
knew that there was something wrong before they figured out I was lost.
mm.
So I think every mother I've
Yeah,
talked to has those stories. Yeah,
perfect example of that quantum
yeah.
connection. It seems to happen with pets too. Um, I know my dogs in the past, um, others in the household would say, well, the dog seems to be waiting by the door when you're on your way home. And it's not the same time, but the dog seems to know that you're on your way home. So I'm sure other people have had other kind of pet examples. And there's actually some people that did plant research on doing, wiring up plants and looking for energy movement there, and them anticipating someone coming back to the laboratory who had burned them with a match previously, the plants like screaming when the person turns around and heads back to the lab. So there's definitely something going on there, this connection between us all. So that's another type of field creation that we believe, a consciousness field between two or more people.
Yeah, that's I think that's out of the book, The Secret Life of Plants. I think that's what it's called. I know I've read
Yes,
it,
that's
but
right.
I've read a lot of books. Yeah, I mean
Mm-hmm.
we get we can go down the road into the mystic arts. I mean it's a whole profession. I believe if it's done properly,
Mm-hmm.
there are people that have that gift and refine it, and
Mm.
it's known in certain police departments and things. They have people that they call upon to try to solve crimes that uh, they're not able to solve any other way. And so,
Mm. So there's also consciousness around a person. So we all have fields of consciousness
mhm.
around us, what we're saying, and we're accessing those, or we can feel the energy of it. Um, and there's also the energy or consciousness around someone's work, like body of work. And I know we've talked about like someone that's really an expert in finance or money and how that can affect you, being around, either watching their video, being around them, or reading their work. You tell us more about that, Clayten.
Well, there's such a charge around money, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just a lot more than a means of exchange. It represents our survival. It represents getting many of our emotional needs met. It represents power in the world. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a story out there that money is evil, and then some people say no, it's the love of money is evil, and that relates back to some biblical quotes that are oftentimes the source of quite a few of our beliefs. And I think we were finding some examples of people that have a high level of consciousness in managing their money and have taught it for many years, and how when you're watching those people, watching their video, or you're in a program with them of some type, there's a piece that comes from their presence and their knowing. Like you have a question, they have an answer, and there's a system behind the answer, and there's a reason, and there's a history of success. And I think an example we talked about was Dave Ramsey. He's really well known, and for certain types of people, he really fits. And yeah,
Mm-hmm. And would you say, Clayten, that there is a transmission? I mean, in that field of consciousness around that person, around money, can it change your own way that you relate to money through that field?
absolutely. I mean, Sherilyn, my partner, she's a certified management accountant, and she doesn't have a lot of drama around money and what it means. And so when
Mm,
you're around someone who's really healthy, if you're not that healthy, you're likely to get healthier. If you're around someone who's at peace
mm,
with money and what it means and its symbology, and if they've had enough for a while and they're not, scrambling for money, there's just a calmness. So yeah, your transmission is, yeah, it would be probably pretty similar to a field, maybe part of a field. I would imagine.
Is that similar to like Grace of the Guru? Like sitting this what's known as Grace of the Guru, where you sit in the presence of someone that's high consciousness and have an effect on your own consciousness.
I would imagine you've experienced that when you went to the Oneness University, Jeff, and spent time with Bhagavan, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
And
Alma
Alma
the
the Hugging
Hugging
Saint. Oh
Saint
yeah.
she's a great example. As you drive into the parking lot, there's a place near Chicago that she has her center, and you drive in the parking lot, you start to feel it, you start to feel the energy, and you walk in a building, it's even more so. And then as you go up to get a hug from her, the closer you get, just the more intense the field is, the energy is. I know you've been to see her as
Oh, it's
well, haven't you,
visceral.
Clayton?
Yeah, you can actually, as you're sitting in line waiting. Yeah, definitely. I noticed in the parking lot, was in the Seattle area when we went, and yeah, there was the parking lot experience, and the hotel was close by, and you're kind of in this bubble, and then you go into the event, and eventually you get in line. Hopefully, if you haven't had a hug before, you get you get preference. And as you're going up towards the stage, there's that energy. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember once I've seen Dr. Hawkins a couple times. That was the highest field I think I've been in. I was standing in line to ask a question. So he does Q&As for a large part of the day, and hundreds of people are lining up. And I was about 50 feet from the stage, and I've been standing in line for probably an hour. And I'm behind my friend Wade. This is down in Los Angeles, and there's 880 people in the room. It was sold out, and I was standing there for an hour and a half. I was a little bit tired, but it just felt like my knees were getting weak. And the Wade's he was 5-time All Canadian Natural Bodybuilding Champion of Canada. I think it was 5 times. Regardless, he's in extraordinarily good shape. So Wade's in front of me. I said, tap him on the shoulder, and it's like, Wade, is it just me, man, or is it like the energy around here? Because I can hardly stand. He looks back at me and he's like, oh man, I'm like, my knees are buckling. So the same thing. And then he said, yeah, look at the people on the stage. And I couldn't really see the stage that well. And there's people on different parts of the stage, and they were like on their chairs, but they were just like, they could hardly sit. And the
Yeah.
field coming off Dr. Hawkins was like, the way we described it later, was like a solar windstorm. It was like, you're like in a windstorm, and that
Mm-hmm.
sand just like kind of sandblasting you. It's like particles
Mm-hmm.
of light just blasting you. And it was just, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it was like one of the best
Yeah.
experiences of my life.
And that's Dr. David
Yeah.
Hawkins. Uh, yeah, that same was really the same with Alma the Hugging Saint. She just um, the energy was just so overwhelming. But I think in her case, the field of consciousness around her is really, maybe it's the same with Dr. David
Mhm.
Hawkins. It was around evolution and around
Yes.
evolving, and self forgiveness seemed to be a big part of her, and unconditional
Yeah.
love. Because you get these hugs, and it's just like you just broken open.
Yeah. For her, it felt like a blessing from a representation of the sacred feminine. When she takes you and she pulls you
Mm,
in, and I know it sounds like mabula,
mm,
mabula, she says something like that. It's probably my son in her language. And yeah, all of us have stories about, you know, women in our life or men in our life or children or parents, and they happen to be a certain gender, so we create this, sometimes unconscious disconnection from that part of life. And
mm,
when I went to there, I felt like there's a lot of stuff just got fixed, stuff I wasn't even aware of. And
mm.
yeah, hopefully get to see her again
Yeah.
now that we can travel.
Hmm. Yeah, the divine feminine field
Yeah.
of consciousness. Beautiful place to be. So the other area that's interesting, and we've noticed in our work on FLFE around this as well, is sort of thought forms or fields of consciousness related to, let's say, larger groups of people. Like collective consciousness. Could you talk a little bit about that, Clayten? That's really an interesting one too.
Well, the first thing that's coming up is, we talked about the Olympics. So when you're watching the Olympics with, I don't know, maybe there's a billion people watching it at the same time. When somebody wins, win the event, or the runner across the finish line, or there's an extraordinary performance. Well, they usually mostly are, or gymnastics. There's just this surge of energy while we're all connected in a positive way. It's really, it's really quite something, and that's the power of, media on the positive sense, when we're unified in, we'll say, inspiration or a celebration of somebody's performance, or if there's a live music event and it's, for the most part, pretty positive, then it's a celebration of life. I mean, halftime at the Super Bowl, right? That's a classic, big party. And of course, then there's the negative side, where if you're connected to a large group of people and something negative happens, I mean, the image of 9/11 is just coming to mind for me. That was just played so much. And then you get pulled into that collective anger or fear or whatever is happening. So live events, I think you've got to have your wits about you a little bit more than if you're watching something that's pre-recorded, or if it's on your own schedule, like, the streaming services, Netflix, Prime, Disney, Google, Apple. Where.
So that collective consciousness or collective event or energy that's occurring when it's live, it hooks into our system, isn't it? Like my actual energetic physical system is really like connected to all those people and to all those feelings at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, the level of sophistication of the recording and the planning of those events, they know the reaction that people are typically going to have when you come from left to right or right to left, if something's going to happen. If it's a really well-planned media event, it's a science. They've got it down to a science. And the science is to move people in a direction. And you got to be really conscious about how to manage that. And there are techniques to do it. Even if you're watching a movie with people in an audience. I remember as a young man going to see Jaws, and the guy next to me, he'd seen it a couple times, right? And he took me in, and I think part of the fun he had of going with people the second or third time, he did the same thing with Star Wars. He was a real movie buff. So I'm sitting literally we were like in the front row because we got there late and it was sold out. And, I've got a death grip on the arm, right? And he's like, looked at me and he laughs me and pokes me. It's like, man, it's not real. Relax. But by that time, I think it was that scene where the shark was up on the back of the boat, and was trying to eat the, and they were, I think they were just, maybe shoving that air tank into its mouth or something. Anyway, some right around that scene. And he poked me a couple times during the movie. He totally caught me. I was just like in the movie. Yeah.
So these are like events, or in that case, a movie. It's something that's playing over and over, but live with an audience who's also all going through the same thing at the same time. But so in a live event, say it's a negative live event that's happening, even if it's bad news, about something that's going through the world and a lot of people are watching at the same time. Do you recommend just kind of disconnecting from those things and maybe watch it later when it's not live?
Yeah, I mean, that's how sensitive you are. Some people are just thick. That's a blessing, we got a friend, I won't mention his name, but we call him a blunt instrument of the Lord. That guy he's got a thick skin, man. So it might not affect him that much. And there's other people who are really sensitive. We got one lady on our team, Maria. highly sensitive person. For someone like her, she might find it a lot harder on her because she's just wired that way. That's not the way she is. So,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I learned, for example, if you're in a movie theater and you're finding yourself being pulled into the story, and it's not a negative, it's not, sorry, not a positive experience, it's kind of negative, is to just, consciously lift your feet off the ground. When you're kind of
Mm-hmm.
disconnecting, you're consciously disconnecting your body from the earth. And if the focus is on you're lifting your feet off the ground or just holding your tongue to the top of your mouth, if you're focused on that, you're not as connected to the movie. And so I
Mm.
found,
Interesting.
when I get into movies and I'm getting caught in those situations, I didn't know that as a kid watching Jaws or Star Wars. This guy took me to. He's a buddy of mine. I was just kind of got lost in it, and that was part of the fun. Is you get to go into another world, of course, and imagine what it could be
Mm-hmm.
like. But I know people that had a hard time taking a bath after watching Jaws. They were so traumatized. They just, yeah,
Yeah.
they joked about it, but it was, they couldn't go in a lake or anything. That's for sure.
So there's events, and then there's sort of an accumulation of thought forms or belief systems. That can be historical, like over a long period of time. People's thoughts, books, recordings, speeches that can create something that continues on. It's, such a, it just seems like it doesn't fit in with normal, how we normally think about it. But let's talk about that a little bit, Clayten, like how belief systems, thought forms accumulated can continue on and affect us now in this time, even though it may be something from, even hundreds of years ago.
Well, I think, you might be a good example of that, Jeff. You're in a multi-generational business, right? Third generation. And, it's
Mm-hmm.
been a well-run business. I keep forgetting I think it's 170 years old, approximately one of them. Yeah.
Yeah,
Plus,
plus.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you can, and when I visited your factory, um, you were showing me, like, introduced me to people. This is Fred, and he's been here 46 years, and this is John, he's been here 37 years. And I'd never been in a place where people had that kind of tenure of time. And,
Mm-hmm.
there's a certain level of sharpness in the culture of the company. And, you're in a factory with brick walls and machines and a concrete floor. And what's that like for you? Because you grew up on that, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a belief system in a business like that has a lot of time, and also in the same space,
Mm-hmm.
same place for all that time. And there's a in that business, it's really a connection to the
Mm-hmm.
customer, and a lot of businesses say that, but really, I just witnessed it over and over how people would just jump in and do whatever needed to be done, to solve something for a customer, like a late order or something, a really big event. We had some really big, large orders that needed to get done on a certain time. But yeah, those belief systems of kind of hard work,
Mm-hmm.
helping each other, and that focus on doing what needs to get done. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before as a thought form accumulation there, a field. But yeah, thanks for
Yeah,
that.
I just thought of it myself. When I was in that factory, there was like a tangible expectation of success. I was like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we win
Mm-hmm.
here. It was like, it was
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't like in a domineering thing or like crushing the competition. It was just there's a commitment to excellence, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it was palpable for me.
So, Clayten, what are some examples of historical thought forms that might be affecting us that we don't even know about, that could have us think thoughts that really aren't our thoughts, but they're coming from somewhere else? What Can
Hmm.
you give us some examples of that?
Well, um, recently there's been some incidents in the news that are I'm thinking of particularly the George Floyd incident and other things that seem to be racially oriented. And I'm part of a men's group, and I remember they were teaching a course on helping everybody explore what race means to them. And I thought that was a really interesting perspective because I don't usually think about that. But at that time, it was really palpable. I mean, people were talking about it, and it kind of brought to my awareness that I live in a small town in the mountains in Canada. We have 10,000 people. It's pretty homogenous in a certain way, although it's changing. And I just never really had a challenge with that in my life. And when I travel in different places, like when I was in the Middle East, lived there for a couple of years, I noticed myself seeing particularly Western European people, Canadians and Americans. I'm Canadian. We would typically dress in a certain way, and in those countries, they just don't reveal that much of their body. Their shorts are below their knees, and there's a certain standard of dress that's just different. And after being there a couple of years, I started noticing how I would have a thought of that person's really dressed inappropriately. And it was a different type of thought than when I first got there. I noticed the difference because it was evident. But as the longer I was there, I noticed there was a bit of a judgment to how they were dressed. And that just hadn't occurred to me before. Like it just was not on my radar. So I think I was tuning into the collective social contract that people had in that area about how you would dress and what it means if you didn't dress that way, that you were disrespecting their customs or something like that. And there wasn't any overt expression of it, but there were some places where they wouldn't let you in if you weren't dressed a certain way, and that's true in a lot of places. I mean, I know even in our town, it's like there's signs on some of the doors: no shirt, no shoes, no service, especially where they're serving food. But, that can be taken to an extreme where people have, I think, their unconscious thoughts about other people. I think that's what was happening to me in the Middle East. I was starting to tune into that. It was becoming unconscious. I had to pay attention to it.
Mm-hmm. So these were thought forms, local or regional thought forms related to religious beliefs that were there, sort of affecting everyone in the area.
Yeah, I certainly didn't have them in, like in Canada or where I was living.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it wasn't a bad thought or a good thought. I mean, there's probably unconscious thought forms that I'm having here that I'm so used to, I don't even know what they are.
Mm-hmm. So there may be, general, either local or national kind of thought forms, maybe even global in some cases, thought forms that are affecting us. What we're talking about here are fields of consciousness, thought forms that show up in us as thoughts that we may think there are thoughts, but they're really thoughts in say the cloud or the field of the local or national area. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's basically, I think, the place we've concluded that that's the place we arrived at together, Jeff. And according to the other ways that we have of measuring truth, that was the conclusion. Yeah, and it's not a new thought. It's just some people maybe haven't thought about it that way, or they may have a different perspective on it than we do from our experience. But it's just good to talk about these things in a language that we can all agree on and start to pay attention to what's going on in our head. There's one of my favorite bumper stickers is "Don't believe everything you think."
Yeah, because they're not our thoughts. There's a small percentage that are actually our thoughts. So one of the origins is these thought forms related to an area. So where do our thoughts come from? We're going to talk at the end of the episode and give people a tool to look at this and sort of test where your thoughts are coming from. And there's thought forms of judgment. I know you were telling me about an experience with a houseless person, Clayten. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I was just walking down the street here, the main street in town, Baker Street, and there's a couple guys that are houseless, if you want to use that word, and usually I don't think much of it. I know the guy. Sometimes I'll say hi, and this particular time, I had a real judgmental thought, and later on when I was kind of past them, I was wondering where that thought came from, because it's usually not there. And so we'll talk about how I tried to discern that later on. But that was just an example of people have thought forms around them. You could call them fields of consciousness. In that case, I imagine that part of the influence would be the other people judging that, because I had a judgmental thought, and there's perhaps an accumulation of thought forms around those people, and maybe they felt shame or embarrassment or awkwardness at that time, and other times they didn't. I don't know really what was going on. I didn't take the time to try to unravel it, even if I could. I don't know that I can. But that was just one experience that had an impact on me, because it was just surprising. What usually isn't there, and it was really there that day.
Mm-hmm. So this idea that thoughts aren't necessarily our thoughts, but maybe coming from other places, that's really a powerful concept. It's like there's so much happening in our heads that we think is us and we think is our thoughts, whether it's maybe an inspirational thought, like, wow, I'm really smart, that really came out. And I think most of the time it's not. It's something you and I see all the time in our field that we've created for FLFE, that these thoughts come up and they're, man, that's way beyond what I could think. And there it is. It came from somewhere. So that's an opportunity there for us to really look and see what's happening. And is that my thought? Is that someone else's thought? And to know that there are these kind of global, national, local thought forms around as we walk around the city, or go to different cities, that there may be different thought forms that come to us.
Yeah, just day-to-day life. It's just it's really interesting when you go to different cultures and they have a different level of appreciation for things. I'm just thinking of Italy and how much they just really, worship good, well-cooked food, and shoes, right? Certain things. Got Italian friends, it's like, they got like shoe closets or clothes closets. And, that's part of their culture, that they grew up that way. And, yeah.
And drinking wine. Going to Italy, like the times I've been to Italy and I've gone out to lunch, and there's all these Italian people there and everybody's drinking wine, and you're just, I'm having 3 or 4 glasses of wine, and, I would never do that here. If I did that at lunchtime in the US, I'd be napping for sure. And in Italy, it's just part of everyday life. It seems to be a field around that, and you might have Italian wine, it's the same wine, it seems. But there's just something different about being in that environment where there's that celebration of life and food and, community. People are going from table to table and coming over to talk to you, and where are you from? And the amount of wine being imbibed is just, but but it doesn't seem to affect anyone. It's really an interesting phenomenon that I noticed.
I'd grown up, I had a good friend named Mark, and he was Italian. That's why I used the Italy story. And he had the best house parties I've ever been to as a kid. I just loved to go over to his place. Him and his parents and his grandparents would be there, and some relatives, and it'd be like almost like that show, My Big Fat Greek Wedding, the movie, where they would all got together, and that's how they were. And I was just thinking of that scene in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where they're having this party, and they're roasting like a lamb or a goat or something on the front lawn, and there's 50 people, and she brings a bunt cake. You remember that scene? It's this little cake with a hole in it.
Mm-hmm.
They've got tables and tables of food, and that's just I just think that's what's just coming to mind. It's a different way of just doing social things.
Well, speaking of food and thought forms, what's going on when I walk by Grater's ice cream and like my whole body is shouting at me to go get an ice cream? What is going on there? There's like so many thoughts, like go in the door, eat this ice cream.
Well, it's interesting. One of the first times when I really got that there's many sources of thoughts is I went to a health food company back in, God, I don't know, decades ago now. And I was standing in line in Edmonton. We're on a road trip. And my friend, who was I was in partnerships with in the business, who was one of the partners, we were standing at the checkout, and there's these little candy called gin-gins or ginsens. They're like a ginger, and they're covered with this powdery white sugar. And I said, "Oh, I'm going to get one of those. You want one?" And he said, "Oh yeah, my bugs, the bugs in my GI tract would really like that." And I was like, I just never put two and together like that. That's where the thought came from. It was the sugar craving, microflora in my GI tract that were craving those candies. And, for them, it's kind of survival. That's how they lived. So I imagine that when you're going by Grater's, which is great ice cream, that, whatever microflora in your body, I don't know how they know it. But I don't know how they know. But I swear that's where those thoughts come from. And, we can talk about how we measure that. And I think it's real.
So the Candida wants some candy.
Candida wants some candy. Yeah.
I wonder if that's where the name came from. Well, let's talk about how people can test where their own thoughts are coming from, or when you get a thought, how can you tell that if that's your thought or not? How do you do that, Clayten? So the thought comes in your head. What would you do to determine if that's your thought or maybe where it came from?
Well, these days, I have a lot more experience with this sort of idea. So if I'm seeing the guy on this, this houseless person, and I start to have a real strong judgment on it, I just assume it's not for me. But for me, the way I learned to do all that was through kinesiology or muscle testing. So, there's a section of chiropractic that is that teaches or uses kinesiology. They teach it obviously in the school, but they use it with patients. So if you go in, you get an adjustment. They'll do a test on your muscle to see if the adjustment is held and if that muscle is now strong. Or nutritionists have used muscle testing for decades now to determine if a supplement or a food is good for you. And, we can talk about that in future episodes, but just to expose people to kinesiology, you have to test your polarity, ask if you have permission to make the inquiry, state for the highest good, and then you would make the inquiry, this thought originated from within me. That would be one way to approach it. We'll probably go into some details with inquiries and how you can play with that. And then you can start to ask questions in different ways and look for the origin of your thoughts. And, our bodies have an innate intelligence that's connected to divinity at all times, which bypasses the mind. And I know you have a different way of doing that, Jeff, which is, it recognizes the intelligence of the body. It's just not as much of a muscle testing process. But do you want to share that?
Yeah, no, so you're talking about self-testing. You're really kind of testing the strength of your muscle. It's either strong during a true statement or it's weak during a false statement.
Yeah.
So, that was my thought that originated, with me, and you get a no, and then you would move on. Yeah, another way that I've done it, I tend to do it, and especially, when I'm out in public somewhere, is I'll feel my heart. So I just kind of get a sense of how my heart feels, just kind of sensations. And I would make the statement, that judgmental thought or that thought was my thought, originated with, in my mind or in my being. And if that's a true statement, I would feel my heart sort of expanding. Just kind of, it feels like soft. It sort of feels soft and open. It feels like my heart's opening. And if it's a false statement, because it really wasn't my thought, then my heart feels tight. It feels like it's contracting in my chest. So you got to get used to doing that. You could try that. It's like you test yourself. My name is Jeffrey Stegman, and I feel that that opening sensation or that warmth or expansion of the heart, and I'll make an untrue statement, and you feel that contraction. So you could practice that way until you kind of feel that moving. And in future episodes, we'll talk about muscle testing and other methods. So yeah, that's a way to test that thought, whether it was your thought or not. So Clayten, do you have a general number of percentage of our thoughts that are our thoughts for the general population? I know you've done some research on that.
Yeah, at one point I did a bunch of pie charts on if you're at a X level of consciousness, these are the 5 places that your thoughts come from, and what slice of the pie is is which. And then if you have X plus level of consciousness and X plus level of consciousness, we can get into that in the future, but I just can't remember it right now. And with the end, with COVID being what it was, the world's starting to bounce back to its higher levels in many ways, but there's a lot of us have, there's been a lot of fear and a lot of challenges, and so we're not some people are higher than they've ever been in consciousness, I suppose, but for a lot of us, we're just kind of getting back to our old selves with the more freedoms we have, and we're able to live our lives the way that we were used to. So it's it has been different.
Yeah, I think we're running out of time with this episode, but in the next episode, we'll talk more about how to measure consciousness, how we measure it on a scale, what the scale looks like, Dr. David Hawkins' map of consciousness, and we'll talk about our experience with that and how we've used it in our own personal evolution and in business with FLFE. So we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you for joining Fields of Consciousness, the podcast of consciousness conversations. We invite you to visit the link below the episode to experience a completely free trial of focused life force energy for 15 days. This is a big part of our life's work, our goal being to support the optimal conditions for the evolution of consciousness in the economized society we live in.
FLFE creates a pristine, loving, energetic environment for people to thrive in. It's our free gift to you, no credit card required. We invite you to subscribe to Fields of Consciousness and tune in next time. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesdays at 11:11 a.m. PST. Onward and upward.